is it like to be modern? Who defines our modernity? Today, we will discuss the definition of modernity and the forces that engendered it, and raise a question of how the world in its present state arrived at our current definition of modernity. We will also discuss the role of modernity in the development of Eastern countries such as ours. The Western notion that modernity is growth in individualism, urbanization, and industrialization, as well as social reforms and changes, engendered the transformation of society into having more powerful socioeconomic and government functions. This standardized notion of modernity invented by the West was highly influenced by the Enlightenment, and this rise in the accessibility of technology spread throughout the East because of colonization and globalization. Colonization and imperialism of the countries in the East made a way for the West to sustain their development and progress, up until now causing them to dominate most aspects of the society of the world. However, along with this advancement, this also allowed oppression of Eastern workers through capitalism. However, the Eastern region also crafted its own version of modernity by adapting the modernity introduced by the West. Ahito posits that the Eastern regions tried to use the modernity influenced by the West to benefit them by using it to standardize and assemble their own system that might give independence from the West. This suggests that the Eastern regions tried to use this to their own advantage in acquiring development and progress. Indeed, the Asia Pacific and South Asia could not have formed their own definition of modernity without Western influence. For instance, although Thailand was never necessarily colonized, it still dealt with threats to their independence from the West, and thus had to resort to modern measures through compromises with the French. Meanwhile, Japan countered Western pressure integrating Western notions of modernity into their own concept of modernity, which thus led to the spread of these ideas in their country. In these two situations, we see countries who were not colonized achieve their own version of modernity, despite the absence of direct influences. They were forced to respond to threats to their country by means that are based on Western practices in order to counter them effectively. Nevertheless, as Kimura posited, modernity in Asia still managed to flourish on their own. For instance, countries like Japan and China play a major role in the global manufacturing market and trade. Asia has also attempted to organize without the presence of Western forces through regional institutions like the Asian Monetary Fund, which unfortunately did not bear fruit, which shows that despite the attempt to detach themselves from Western modernity, it remains pervasive and these Western powers continue to keep them from being fully independent.
And yes, just like that, modernity by the end of the colonization made it through the Philippines. However, it didn't prevent the Philippines from becoming its own unique nation. Or did it? For this, we would like to focus on a certain aspect of the Philippine society that's relevant today: education. In it, we would find that the Philippines is both a reflection of itself and its predecessors brought about by colonization. And as they say in 1968, that the Ateneo was indeed irrelevant to the Philippine situation because it can do no more than to service the power elite. And yes again, the Ateneo adheres to the empowerment of the Filipino nation, but its shared identity as a Western adhering institution then made it quite clear that it lacked Filipinization. Not that we are directly American bootlickers, or foreign-leaning, as that entails a different topic. We are for a fact creating graduates better off at American graduate schools, entering universities abroad without any prospect of returning home. Back then, the brain drain of the Ateneans was a realization that we are academically dependent, better off abroad, rather than solving problems here at home. The kind of development and modernity was hindered by the fact that the intelligentsia was almost non-existent, irrelevant. They entered the university as the Filipinos and graduated as Americans, the reverse of Filipinization. Our idea of modernity was indeed an outsourced element from the states and academic hegemons, as our way to self-accomplishment and progress, even at independence, post-war, and the Third Republic in 1968, is the vertical rate of how much of our intelligentsia we are willing to give, for others' benefit, of course. Thus, the guide in 1968 explicitly recommends to close down Ateneo educational institutions, except in Manila, to concentrate Filipino Jesuit manpower here and revamp the system entirely to uphold Filipinization, its own course of development for the country. But with the trend of brain drain and a bit of magis, the adverse solution was a guarantee to make sure that our future leaders remain here at home. So no, without foreign influence, the Philippine nation cannot flourish as the intelligentsia merely complies with the Western schema.
We began this video by discussing the role of the Western world in modernity through its processes of colonialism. Indeed, Asia could not have formed its own definition of modernity without Western influence. Even in Eastern countries where the West did not directly colonize, modernity was still indirectly influenced by external Western pressure. Nevertheless, modernity in Asia still managed to flourish on its own, although the domination of Western powers continues to keep Asia from being fully independent of Western influence. With that, then, the group concludes that although present day Asia has crafted its own version of modernity, the initial process of development to the modern day era is owed to Western influences and pressure. The group commends the emphasis on colonialism as a major force of Western influence in the global stage. However, the group would like to highlight that this Western influence, although having had a hand in the development of Eastern countries, also served as a tool for oppression. This is where the module fails to explore the negative effects of the Western influence. The group also condemns the notion that Western influence has become a necessary evil in order for Eastern countries to develop, and raises that even without Western influence, modernity could have developed in a way that is not defined by Western standards. With that, the group ends the discussion. Thank you for listening.